Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true airline horror stories that will make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about air travel safety. These are not Hollywood fiction or urban legends, but authenticated accounts from pilots, flight attendants, and passengers who experienced the unthinkable at 35,000 feet, where help cannot arrive and escape is impossible. Each story has been compiled from official incident reports, witness testimonies, and verified documentation from aviation authorities around the world. The skies hold terrors that most travelers will never encounter. And after tonight, you may understand why some of these incidents were quietly buried in classified files. If you appreciate genuine horror content drawn from real events that challenge your sense of security, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into humanity's darkest true encounters. After you hear these harrowing accounts, share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us if you have ever experienced something unexplainable during your own travels. Now prepare yourself as we ascend into the nightmare that awaits when the ordinary becomes impossible to explain. This happened on a late-night flight from San Francisco to Boston in early March of last year. Addison Harper had just finished a grueling week of back-to-back meetings with clients on the West Coast. She worked as a marketing consultant for a pharmaceutical company, and the trip had been exhausting in every possible way. Her body ached from sitting in boardrooms for hours on end. Her mind felt foggy from too much coffee and too little sleep. And all she wanted was to collapse into her own bed 3,000 miles away. The airport was nearly empty when she arrived at 11:30 that night. The terminal felt eerily quiet, with only a handful of passengers scattered throughout the waiting area near her gate. Most were business travelers like herself, hunched over laptops or scrolling through their phones with glazed expressions. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a persistent buzz that seemed louder in the absence of the usual airport chaos. Addison grabbed a bottled water from a vending machine and found a seat away from everyone else. She checked her phone for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, confirming that her flight was still on schedule for a 12:45 departure. When boarding finally began, Addison shuffled down the jet bridge with the other passengers, most of whom looked just as exhausted as she felt. She had booked a window seat in row 14, hoping she could lean against the side of the plane and sleep for most of the flight. As she settled into her seat and shoved her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her, she noticed how cold the cabin felt. It was unusually frigid despite the fact that it was nearly spring. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and wondered if the air conditioning was malfunctioning. The plane was only about half full, which meant the middle seat next to Addison remained empty. A businessman in his 50s took the aisle seat, immediately put in earbuds, and closed his eyes. Addison was grateful for the buffer of space. She buckled her seatbelt and settled in as the flight attendants went through their pre-flight safety demonstration. The engines roared to life, and within 20 minutes, they were taxiing down the runway. Addison watched through the window as the lights of San Francisco grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely beneath a blanket of clouds. She must have dozed off shortly after takeoff, because the next thing she remembered was being jolted awake by a sudden commotion. Addison blinked hard, trying to orient herself. The cabin lights were dimmed, and most of the other passengers appeared to be asleep or quietly absorbed in their own activities. But 3 rows ahead, something was very wrong. A man in his 30s was convulsing violently in his seat. His entire body was rigid, his back arched unnaturally, and his arms were jerking in spasmodic motions that looked almost mechanical. The woman sitting next to him had jumped up and was screaming for help. 2 flight attendants rushed down the aisle, their faces tight with concern. One of them immediately grabbed the intercom and made an announcement that sent a chill down Addison's spine. The voice was calm, but urgent. If there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please identify yourself immediately. We have a medical emergency. Addison felt her heart begin to race. She leaned forward in her seat, trying to see what was happening. The man was still convulsing, and now she could see that something dark was running from his nose. At first, she thought it was just a nosebleed, but as one of the flight attendants bent down to help him, Addison saw the attendant recoil in horror. The substance dripping from the man's nose was not just blood. It was thick and dark, almost black in the dim cabin light. And then Addison saw his eyes. Blood was streaming from the corners of his eyes, running down his cheeks in grotesque rivulets. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his lips were turning blue. The flight attendants were trying to stabilize him, but his body continued to convulse with terrifying force. Addison heard one of them shout something about getting the emergency medical kit. Another passenger, a woman who identified herself as a nurse, hurried forward to assist. For the next 20 minutes, Addison watched in frozen horror as the medical personnel on board attempted to save the man's life. They laid him flat in the aisle and began performing CPR. The nurse barked instructions while one of the flight attendants did chest compressions. The other attendant administered oxygen and checked vital signs. But despite their efforts, the man's condition only seemed to worsen. His convulsions eventually stopped, but not in a way that suggested recovery. His body simply went limp, lifeless. The entire cabin had gone silent. Passengers were staring wide-eyed at the scene unfolding in the aisle. Some had their hands over their mouths, others were crying quietly. Addison felt bile rise in her throat. She had never seen anyone die before, and the sheer brutality of what she had just witnessed left her shaking. The man had been alive less than half an hour ago, sitting in his seat just like everyone else. And now he was gone. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but grave. He explained that there had been a medical emergency and that the passenger had not survived. He assured everyone that the crew was doing everything possible to handle the situation with respect and dignity. He also said that they would be continuing to Boston rather than making an emergency landing, as there was nothing more that could be done for the deceased passenger. The body was carefully moved to the galley area at the front of the plane and covered with blankets. Addison could not stop staring at the spot where the man had been. She felt a deep, primal fear settling into her bones. What had killed him? Why had he bled from his eyes and nose like that? Was it contagious? She looked around at the other passengers and saw her own fear reflected in their faces. No one spoke. No one moved. The cabin felt like a tomb. The rest of the flight was the longest 4 hours of Addison's life. She could not sleep. She could not even close her eyes without seeing the image of that man convulsing, blood streaming down his face. She kept replaying the scene over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it. She had read about hemorrhagic fevers in the news, diseases like Ebola that caused people to bleed from their orifices. But those were supposed to be rare, confined to remote parts of Africa or controlled outbreaks. This was a commercial flight from San Francisco to Boston. This was not supposed to happen here. When the plane finally landed at Logan International Airport, Addison expected them to disembark immediately. Instead, the captain made another announcement. He instructed everyone to remain seated and calm. He said that officials from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention would be boarding the aircraft to conduct health screenings. Addison's stomach dropped. This was serious. This was very, very serious. Within minutes, a team of officials in full hazmat suits entered the plane. The sight of them was surreal, like something out of a science fiction movie. They wore white protective suits with hoods, gloves, and face shields. They carried medical equipment and clipboards. One of them spoke through a small megaphone, explaining that every passenger and crew member would need to be tested before they could leave the plane. He assured them that this was purely a precautionary measure, but his tone suggested otherwise. The testing process took hours. Each passenger was interviewed about their symptoms, travel history, and any contact they may have had with the deceased man. Addison answered their questions truthfully, explaining that she had been seated 3 rows behind him and had not interacted with him at any point. They took her temperature, drew a small blood sample, and swabbed the inside of her nose and throat. The entire time, she felt like she was going to vomit from fear. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the morning by the time Addison was finally cleared to leave the plane. She had been awake for over 24 hours, and her body felt like it was shutting down. But the fear kept her alert. As she walked through the terminal, flanked by CDC officials who escorted all of the passengers to a separate quarantine area, she overheard 2 of them talking in low voices. One of them mentioned that the deceased man had recently returned from a medical mission trip to Liberia. He had been exhibiting flu-like symptoms for the past 2 days, but had assumed it was just exhaustion. Addison felt her blood run cold. Liberia, West Africa, hemorrhagic fever. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was horrifying. The passengers were held in a quarantine facility at the airport for another 6 hours while their test results were processed. Addison sat in a plastic chair in a sterile white room, staring at the wall and trying not to think about what might be growing inside her body at that very moment. She thought about her family, her friends, her co-workers. She thought about everyone she had been in contact with over the past week. If she was infected, how many people had she exposed? When the results finally came back, Addison was told that she had tested negative for any known hemorrhagic viruses. But the officials explained that the deceased man had been carrying a strain of a virus similar to Ebola, one that was not yet fully understood by the medical community. It was highly contagious and had a mortality rate of over 60%. He had likely contracted it during his time in Liberia and had been asymptomatic during his flight from Africa to San Francisco. By the time he boarded the red-eye to Boston, the virus had progressed to its final, most deadly stage. Addison was given a pamphlet about symptoms to watch for and instructions to self-quarantine for the next 2 weeks. She was told to monitor her temperature twice a day and report any signs of illness immediately. If she developed symptoms, she was to go directly to the nearest hospital and inform them of her potential exposure. She took a taxi home in a daze. Her apartment felt foreign, like she was seeing it for the first time. She stripped off her clothes and threw them directly into the washing machine, scrubbing her hands and arms until her skin was raw. She took the hottest shower she could stand, letting the water scald her until she felt clean. But no amount of soap or water could wash away the memory of what she had seen. For the next 2 weeks, Addison barely left her apartment. She worked from home, ordered groceries to be delivered, and avoided all human contact. Every morning and evening, she took her temperature with shaking hands, terrified that the thermometer would show a fever. Every time she felt the slightest tickle in her throat or the faintest ache in her body, she was convinced that this was it. This was the moment the virus revealed itself. But the symptoms never came. Her temperature remained normal. Her test results continued to come back negative. By the end of the 2-week quarantine period, the doctors confirmed that she had not been infected. She was safe. But Addison did not feel safe. She felt haunted. She could not stop thinking about that man on the plane, the way his body had convulsed, the blood that had streamed from his eyes. She wondered if he had known he was sick. She wondered if he had been afraid. She wondered about his family, the people who would never see him again because of a virus he had contracted while trying to help others. Even now, a year later, Addison still thinks about that flight. She still sees his face in her nightmares. And every time she boards a plane, she finds herself scrutinizing the other passengers, looking for signs of illness, wondering if she is about to live through another nightmare at 35,000 feet. She no longer takes red-eye flights. She obsessively checks health advisories before traveling. She carries hand sanitizer and disinfectant wipes everywhere she goes. Her friends tell her that she is being paranoid, that lightning does not strike twice. But they were not there. They did not see what she saw. They do not understand that sometimes the most terrifying thing about flying is not the risk of a crash. It is the risk of being trapped in a metal tube with something invisible, something deadly, something that can steal the life from a person in a matter of hours and leave everyone else wondering if they will be next. Addison learned that night that death does not always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it walks onto a plane, takes a seat, and waits. And when it finally reveals itself, there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and nothing anyone can do but watch and pray that they are not next in line. Ryan Mitchell had been working as a flight attendant for Transatlantic Airways for nearly 6 years. In that time, he had dealt with every imaginable passenger situation. Crying babies, drunk businessmen, nervous flyers who needed constant reassurance, medical emergencies, and even the occasional unruly passenger who had to be restrained. He thought he had seen it all. He was wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when Ryan reported for duty on Flight 447 from Seattle to Miami. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, the kind of flying conditions that made his job easier. He went through his pre-flight routine with the same practiced efficiency he had developed over thousands of flights. He checked the emergency equipment, reviewed the passenger manifest, and greeted his fellow crew members. Everything was standard. Everything was normal. The flight was relatively empty, which was not unusual for a midweek afternoon departure. According to the manifest, there were 33 passengers on board, scattered throughout the cabin in a way that left most of the middle seats vacant. Ryan appreciated these quieter flights. They gave him time to actually connect with passengers rather than rushing through service like he did on packed weekend flights. As passengers boarded, Ryan stood near the front of the cabin, welcoming each person with a smile and helping them locate their seats. Most travelers nodded politely and moved past him without much interaction. But one man stood out. He was middle-aged, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khaki pants, the uniform of 1,000 suburban fathers across America. He smiled warmly at Ryan as he boarded and said something about looking forward to getting home to see his family. Ryan did not think much of it at the time. It was the kind of pleasant, forgettable exchange he had dozens of times on every flight. The man moved down the aisle, and Ryan turned his attention to the next passenger. By the time boarding was complete and the cabin door was secured, Ryan had already forgotten about the interaction entirely. The flight took off on schedule at 2:15. Ryan and his fellow flight attendants went through the safety demonstration, a choreographed routine they could perform in their sleep. Once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was turned off, they began beverage service. Ryan started at the front of the cabin with his cart, working his way down the aisle row by row. When he reached row 27, he found the middle-aged man he had noticed during boarding sitting in seat 27C, the aisle seat. The man smiled up at him with that same warm, friendly expression. Ryan asked what he would like to drink, and the man requested a ginger ale. As Ryan poured the drink, the man began talking about his family. He said he had been on a business trip in Seattle for the past week and was eager to get home to Miami. He talked about his wife, how they had been married for 22 years, and how she still made him laugh every single day. He talked about his two daughters, ages 17 and 14, and how proud he was of them. The older one was applying to colleges and wanted to study marine biology. The younger one was obsessed with volleyball and played on her school team. Ryan found himself genuinely engaged in the conversation. There was something authentic and kind about this man, something that made Ryan want to listen. The man even pulled out his phone and showed Ryan photos of his family. There was a picture of his wife standing on a beach at sunset, her hair blowing in the wind. There were pictures of his daughters in graduation gowns and volleyball uniforms, smiling bright, youthful smiles. Ryan complimented the man on his beautiful family and moved on with his cart, feeling a small warmth in his chest. It was interactions like these that reminded him why he loved his job, despite its many frustrations. About an hour later, Ryan was collecting trash and offering passengers refills on their drinks. When he reached row 27, he noticed that the woman sitting in seat 27D, the window seat, was looking around with a confused expression. She flagged Ryan down and asked when the person sitting in 27C would be returning from the bathroom. Ryan glanced at the empty aisle seat and felt a small flutter of confusion. He told her he would check and walked toward the rear lavatories. Both were vacant, doors unlocked and lights off. That was strange. Perhaps the man had gone to one of the lavatories at the front of the plane. Ryan walked back up the aisle, checking each bathroom as he passed. All of them were empty. He felt a prickle of unease beginning to form at the base of his skull. Where had the man gone? It was not a large plane. There were only so many places a person could be. Ryan walked the entire length of the cabin, checking each row carefully. The man was nowhere to be found. Ryan returned to the galley at the front of the plane and found his colleague, Maria, preparing coffee. He asked if she had seen the man from seat 27C. Maria looked at him with a blank expression and asked what he was talking about. Ryan described the man: the graying hair, the wire-rimmed glasses, the khaki pants. Maria shook her head. She said she had not seen anyone matching that description. Ryan insisted that he had served the man a ginger ale less than an hour ago, that they had talked for several minutes about his family. Maria's expression shifted from confusion to concern. She suggested they check the manifest again. They pulled up the digital passenger list on Maria's tablet. Ryan scrolled down to row 27, seat 27A, occupied. Seat 27B, vacant. Seat 27C, vacant. Seat 27D, occupied. Ryan felt his stomach drop. That could not be right. He had seen the man. He had talked to him. He had served him a drink. He told Maria there must be an error in the system, that sometimes the manifest did not update properly. Maria looked at him with worried eyes and suggested they ask the woman in 27D. Ryan walked back to row 27, trying to keep his expression calm and professional. He leaned down and quietly asked the woman in 27D if she could describe the person who had been sitting next to her in 27C. The woman looked at him as if he had lost his mind. She said no one had been sitting next to her. She said she specifically chose that row because it was empty and she wanted extra space. Ryan felt a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He insisted that there had been someone sitting there, a middle-aged man with glasses. The woman shook her head firmly. She said she had been in that row since boarding and the seat next to her had been empty the entire time. Ryan returned to the galley feeling dizzy and disoriented. Maria suggested he sit down for a moment, that perhaps he was confusing passengers from a previous flight. But Ryan knew what he had seen. He knew what he remembered. He had talked to that man. He had looked at photos on the man's phone. It had been real. It had to have been real. For the rest of the flight, Ryan could not shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. He kept walking past row 27, expecting to see the man sitting there reading a magazine or watching the in-flight entertainment. But seat 27C remained empty, mocking him with its vacancy. He questioned his own sanity. Had he imagined the entire interaction? Was he having some kind of mental breakdown? But the details were so vivid, so specific. He could still picture the man's face, could still hear his voice describing his daughter's accomplishments. When the plane finally landed in Miami, Ryan could barely focus on his duties. He went through the motions of preparing the cabin for arrival, helping passengers retrieve their luggage from the overhead bins, and wishing everyone a pleasant day. But his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the impossibility of what had happened at 35,000 feet. After all the passengers had deplaned, Ryan sat in the empty cabin and tried to make sense of it. That was when he noticed something strange. He pulled out his phone to check his messages and saw that his photo gallery had several new images. He opened the app and felt his blood turn to ice. There were 4 photos he did not remember taking. They were the same photos the man had shown him: the woman on the beach, the 2 daughters in their graduation gowns and volleyball uniforms. But these photos looked different somehow. The quality was strange, slightly faded, as if they were old. Ryan zoomed in on the image of the wife on the beach. In the bottom right corner, there was a date stamp: September 14th, 1987. Ryan's hands began to tremble. That was impossible. Those photos had looked contemporary when the man showed them, to him. But now, looking at them on his own phone, they were clearly decades old. The hairstyles, the clothing, even the quality of the image itself spoke to a different era. How had these photos gotten onto his phone? He had not taken them. He had not downloaded them. They had simply appeared. That night, back at his hotel room in Miami, Ryan could not sleep. He kept staring at the photos on his phone, trying to understand what had happened. On impulse, he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took a screenshot of one of the photos showing the man with his wife and daughters and ran it through a reverse image search. Within seconds, results appeared. The first link was to a news article from 1992. The headline read, "Local family of 4 dies in tragic plane crash." Ryan clicked on the article with shaking hands. The story detailed how a commercial flight from Seattle to Miami had crashed during severe weather, killing all 46 people on board. Among the victims were Jonathan Reeves, age 47, his wife Catherine, age 45, and their 2 daughters, Emily and Sarah, ages 17 and 14. The article included a family photo. It was the same photo the man had shown Ryan. It was the same photo that was now inexplicably saved on his phone. Ryan read the article 3 times, each time hoping he had misunderstood something, that there was some rational explanation. But there was not. The man he had talked to, the man who had told him about his wife and daughters, had been dead for decades, and he had died on a flight from Seattle to Miami, the exact same route Ryan had just worked. Ryan began researching obsessively. He learned that Jonathan Reeves had been a sales representative who traveled frequently for work. He learned that the crash had been caused by a catastrophic engine failure during a storm. He learned that the plane had gone down over the Everglades and that it had taken rescue teams days to recover all of the bodies. He learned that seat assignments from that flight showed Jonathan Reeves had been sitting in seat 27C. The next morning, Ryan went to the airport operations office and requested to review the security footage from the previous day's flight. The supervisor was reluctant, but eventually agreed when Ryan explained that he needed to verify something for his own peace of mind. They pulled up the footage from the boarding area and then from the cabin cameras. Ryan watched himself welcoming passengers as they boarded. He watched the cabin fill with travelers finding their seats and stowing their luggage. But when the camera angle showed row 27, seat 27C remained empty throughout the entire boarding process. No one sat there. No one had ever sat there. Ryan then asked them to review the footage from the beverage service. The supervisor fast-forwarded to the moment when Ryan was serving drinks in row 27. On the screen, Ryan could see himself standing in the aisle, holding a can of ginger ale and pouring it into a cup. But he was pouring it into empty air. There was no passenger in 27C. The seat was vacant. Yet in the video, Ryan was clearly talking to someone, gesturing with his free hand, smiling and nodding, as if engaged in conversation. To anyone watching the footage, it looked like Ryan was having an animated conversation with an empty seat. The supervisor looked at Ryan with deep concern and suggested he take some time off, maybe see a counselor. Ryan numbly agreed. He left the office in a daze and drove straight to the airport's employee health services. But what was he supposed to tell them? That he had spent 15 minutes talking to a ghost? That a dead man had shown him photos from 1987 that were now saved on his phone? That he had served a ginger ale to someone who had died in a plane crash 30 years ago? Ryan never worked another flight after that day. He requested a transfer to ground operations and spent the next 2 years working behind a desk, processing paperwork and scheduling crews. He could not bring himself to step onto a plane again. Every time he walked past a gate and saw passengers boarding, he wondered if any of them were real. He wondered how many of them were trapped in some loop, doomed to repeat the same flight over and over, unaware that they had never made it to their destination. He still has the photos on his phone. He has never deleted them, though he has never looked at them again either. Sometimes late at night, when he cannot sleep, he thinks about Jonathan Reeves sitting in seat 27C, smiling and talking about his family, showing off pictures of the wife and daughters he was on his way home to see. Ryan wonders if Jonathan knows he is dead. He wonders if Jonathan is still trying to get home, still boarding that same flight from Seattle to Miami, still believing that this time, finally, he will make it. Ryan does not work for the airline anymore. He quit 2 years ago and took a job in a completely different field. He has not set foot on a plane since that September afternoon. And whenever someone asks him why he gave up a career he once loved, he simply says that he got tired of flying. He never tells them the truth. He never tells them about the man in seat 27C who was there and not there, who died 3 decades ago but still remembers his daughter's names, who somehow reached across the boundary between life and death to have one more conversation about the family he loved. Because if he told them the truth, they would think he was crazy. And maybe he is. But the photos on his phone tell him otherwise. They tell him that what he experienced was real, even if it should not have been possible. They tell him that sometimes the dead do not know they are supposed to let go. And sometimes they board a plane heading home, hoping that this time will be different. Lucy Chen had always been a meticulous planner. As a corporate lawyer for an international firm based in London, she was used to controlling every variable in her professional life. Her overnight flight from London to Singapore was no different. She had booked her ticket 3 months in advance, secured an aisle seat in the business class cabin for extra legroom, and packed her carry-on with everything she might need for the 13-hour journey. Work documents, noise-canceling headphones, an eye mask, and her travel pillow were all neatly organized in the leather bag beneath her seat. The flight departed Heathrow at 11:30 in the evening. Lucy settled into seat 12C, grateful for the relatively empty cabin. Business travel on a Tuesday night meant fewer passengers, which usually translated to a quieter, more comfortable flight. The man sitting next to her in seat 12D introduced himself as David. He appeared to be in his early 40s, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt. He carried a briefcase and wore the same tired expression that Lucy recognized on her own face. Another road warrior, she assumed. Another professional grinding through the endless cycle of airports and hotels and conference rooms. They exchanged the polite small talk that strangers on planes always do. Where are you headed? Business or pleasure? How long will you be there? Lucy mentioned she was heading to Singapore for a week of client meetings. David said he was in pharmaceutical sales and traveled to Asia frequently. The conversation was pleasant enough, forgettable in its ordinariness. Lucy put in her headphones after takeoff and closed her eyes, hoping to get at least a few hours of sleep before they landed. She woke 4 hours into the flight to the sensation of being watched. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim cabin lighting. Most of the other passengers appeared to be sleeping, their seats reclined and blankets pulled up to their chins. But David was wide awake, staring at her with an intensity that made her stomach clench. His face was only inches from hers, leaning across the armrest that separated their seats. When he saw that she was awake, he smiled. Lucy pulled out her headphones and sat up straighter, putting as much distance between them as the confined space would allow. She asked if something was wrong, trying to keep her voice steady. David continued smiling, that unsettling expression never leaving his face. He told her that he had been watching her sleep for the past hour. He said she looked peaceful, vulnerable. He said he liked watching the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. Lucy felt ice water flood her veins. She told him firmly that his behavior was inappropriate and that he needed to stop. David laughed softly and leaned even closer. He told her that he knew where she lived. He recited her home address in London, the street name and building number, even her apartment unit. Lucy felt her hands begin to shake. She demanded to know how he had that information. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of photographs. Lucy recognized herself in every single image. There she was, leaving her apartment building on a Tuesday morning, dressed in her navy suit and carrying her briefcase. There she was at the grocery store, reaching for a carton of milk. There she was at the gym, walking on a treadmill with her earbuds in. There she was sitting at a coffee shop near her office, working on her laptop. The photos had been taken over weeks, maybe months. Someone had been following her, documenting her routines, learning her patterns. And that someone was sitting right next to her at 35,000 feet with nowhere for her to escape. David told her that he'd been watching her for 8 months. He knew what time she left for work each morning. He knew which tube station she used and which exit she took. He knew that she went to the gym every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evening. He knew that she bought her coffee from the same shop every day and that she always ordered a flat white with oat milk. He knew that she lived alone and that she traveled for work at least twice a month. He told her that getting on this flight with her had required careful planning, but that it was worth it. He had finally engineered an opportunity where they could be alone together, where she could not just walk away from him. Lucy tried to remain calm. She told David that she needed to use the restroom and attempted to stand. David grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave marks. He told her to sit back down. He told her that they were not finished talking. Lucy felt panic rising in her throat, but forced herself to breathe slowly. She discreetly pressed the call button for the flight attendant. When the flight attendant arrived, Lucy quietly explained that she was feeling uncomfortable and asked if there was another seat available in the cabin. She tried to keep her voice low, not wanting to cause a scene that might escalate the situation. The flight attendant glanced at David, who was now staring straight ahead with a blank expression. The attendant said she would check on available seats and returned a few minutes later to say that the flight was completely full. There were no other seats in business class. Lucy asked if she could move to economy anywhere else on the plane. The flight attendant looked uncertain, but agreed to make arrangements. David turned to face Lucy again. His expression had shifted from pleasant to something darker, more volatile. He told her that he knew she traveled alone every month for work. He knew her travel schedule better than she did. He knew which hotels she stayed at and which restaurants she ate at when she was too tired to go out. He told her that moving seats would not change anything. He would still know where she was. He would still be able to find her. The flight attendant returned and offered to move Lucy to a seat in the economy cabin. As Lucy stood to gather her belongings, she noticed that David's carry-on bag was partially unzipped. Inside, she could see duct tape, plastic zip ties, and coiled rope. Her blood turned to ice. She grabbed her bag and followed the flight attendant to the back of the plane, her legs barely supporting her weight. Once Lucy was reseated in economy, the flight attendant informed the captain of the situation. The captain made the decision to alert authorities and requested that air marshals on board keep an observation on David for the remainder of the flight. The plane had a scheduled layover in Dubai before continuing to Singapore. The captain coordinated with Dubai airport security to have David removed during the stopover. Lucy spent the rest of the flight in a state of hypervigilance. Every time she saw movement in the aisle, she tensed, expecting David to appear. She could not eat. She could not sleep. She could only sit with her arms wrapped around herself, trying to process what had just happened. She kept replaying David's words in her mind, the casual way he had described following her, the detailed knowledge he had of her life. How long had he been planning this? What had he intended to do to her? When the plane landed in Dubai, Lucy watched from her seat as two armed security officers boarded the aircraft and escorted David off. He went quietly, without protest, but turned to look directly at Lucy as he was led down the aisle. The expression on his face was not anger or fear. It was satisfaction, as if this outcome was exactly what he had expected. As if he had already won something that Lucy did not yet understand. Airport security in Dubai questioned Lucy for over an hour. They asked her to provide a detailed statement about what had happened on the flight. Lucy told them everything, from David's admission of stalking her to the disturbing items she had seen in his bag. When security searched David's checked luggage, they found a small pharmacy of sedatives and prescription medications, detailed floor plans of Lucy's apartment building in London, and more photographs. Hundreds of photographs. Not just of Lucy, but of other women as well. Women in different cities across Europe and Asia. All professional women who traveled alone for work. The security officers told Lucy that David was a known predator who had been wanted in connection with multiple assaults in 3 different countries. He specifically targeted businesswomen who flew international routes alone. He would identify his victims through social media and public professional profiles, learn their travel patterns, and then book himself on the same flights. His plan was always the same. Establish himself as a fellow business traveler, someone respectable and non-threatening. gain his victims' trust during the flight, follow them to their hotel after landing, break into their rooms in the early hours of the morning when they were alone and vulnerable in a foreign country where they had no support system. Lucy had been his intended victim that night in Singapore. Security found hotel booking confirmations on David's phone for the same hotel where Lucy was scheduled to stay. They found detailed maps marking the location of her room and notes about the security layout of the building. If Lucy had not noticed the items in his bag, if she had not alerted the flight crew, she would have arrived in Singapore alone with no idea that she was being hunted. David was arrested and extradited to the United Kingdom to face charges for stalking, assault, and attempted kidnapping. Lucy testified at his trial 6 months later. She learned that she was one of 14 women he had targeted over a 5-year period. 3 of those women had been assaulted. 1 had died. Lucy had escaped only because she had seen the duct tape in his bag, only because a flight attendant had taken her concerns seriously, only because the captain had made the decision to remove David during the stopover instead of waiting until Singapore. Lucy does not travel alone anymore. She books flights only when colleagues are traveling to the same destination. She has hired a private security consultant who monitors her social media and professional profiles to ensure that no personal information about her travel schedule is publicly accessible. She moved to a new apartment in a building with 24-hour security. She no longer goes to the gym at predictable times or shops at the same stores or follows any kind of routine that could be observed and documented. She still flies for work because her career demands it. But she no longer sleeps on planes. She no longer makes small talk with the strangers sitting next to her. She no longer trusts that the person in the expensive suit with the tired smile is just another road warrior trying to get through a long flight. Because she knows now that predators do not always announce themselves with violence. Sometimes they sit right next to you with a briefcase and a friendly smile and detailed plans to destroy your life. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and becoming another statistic is noticing a roll of duct tape in a partially open bag. Christopher Hale had been a commercial pilot for 15 years. In that time, he had flown through violent thunderstorms, navigated emergency landings when engines failed, and kept his composure when passengers panicked at 35,000 feet. He prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, to make rational decisions when others around him were losing control. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what happened on the afternoon flight from Denver to Phoenix. It was a routine Tuesday afternoon in late October. Christopher arrived at the airport 2 hours before his scheduled departure time, as always. He completed his pre-flight checklist with the same methodical precision he had practiced thousands of times. The weather forecast showed clear skies and minimal wind along their route. The aircraft, a regional commuter jet with capacity for 70 passengers, had passed all mechanical inspections. Everything indicated that this would be an unremarkable 2-hour flight, the kind Christopher could fly in his sleep. His first officer that day was a younger pilot named Nathan, who had only recently been promoted from flight training. Nathan was eager, competent, and perhaps a bit too enthusiastic about everything related to aviation. Christopher appreciated working with newer pilots because it reminded him of why he had fallen in love with flying in the first place. As they settled into the cockpit and began running through their checklists, Nathan asked questions about the route, the weather patterns they might encounter, and the best practices for communicating with air traffic control. Christopher answered patiently, enjoying the role of mentor. Boarding proceeded without incident. The flight was only about half full, which meant they would have a lighter load and better fuel efficiency. Christopher watched through the cockpit windows as ground crew finished loading luggage and preparing the aircraft for departure. The cabin crew completed their safety demonstrations, and within 30 minutes, they were cleared for takeoff. The engines roared to life, and Christopher felt that familiar surge of adrenaline as they accelerated down the runway and lifted into the Colorado sky. They reached their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet right on schedule. Christopher engaged the autopilot and settled back in his seat, mentally reviewing their route and estimated arrival time. Nathan was monitoring the instruments, occasionally glancing out the window at the landscape far below. They were flying over the Rocky Mountains, those ancient peaks that Christopher had flown over hundreds of times. The view never got old, the way the afternoon sunlight painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. That was when Christopher first heard it, a crackling sound over the radio, followed by what sounded like children laughing. He frowned and checked the frequency. They were tuned to the standard air traffic control channel. The laughing faded, replaced by static, and then a voice. A child's voice, small and frightened and impossibly clear. "Help us. Please help us. It is so cold here." Christopher glanced at Nathan, whose expression mirrored his own confusion. Nathan leaned forward and adjusted the radio controls, thinking perhaps they had accidentally picked up a stray signal from another frequency. But the voice continued, growing more desperate. "We cannot find our parents. We cannot see anything. It is so dark and so cold. Why will nobody help us?" Christopher felt a chill run down his spine. He pressed the transmit button and spoke carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is Flight 227. Who is speaking? What is your location?" There was a long pause filled with static, and then the child spoke again. "We are on the plane in the mountains. We have been here so long. Nobody came to help us. We called and called, but nobody answered." Nathan was staring at the radio with wide eyes. Christopher checked their frequency again. They were definitely tuned to the emergency channel 121.5, the International Aviation Distress frequency. But there was no flight in distress in the area. He contacted air traffic control and asked if they were receiving any emergency signals. The controller responded that everything was clear, no distress calls, no reported emergencies. Christopher did not mention the voice. He did not know how to explain what they were hearing. The voice changed then. It multiplied. What had been one child became many children, all speaking at once, their words overlapping in a chorus of fear and confusion. "Where are our parents? Why is it so dark? We are so cold. Please help us." The temperature in the cockpit dropped suddenly and dramatically. Christopher could see his breath misting in the air in front of him. Nathan was shivering, pulling his jacket tighter. Christopher checked the environmental controls. Everything appeared normal. The cabin temperature should have been a comfortable 70 degrees, but it felt like it had plummeted to near freezing. Then came the smell. Smoke, acrid and sharp, filling the cockpit with terrifying intensity. Christopher's training kicked in immediately. He scanned the instrument panel, looking for fire indicators, checking engine temperatures, searching for any sign of what was burning. Every gauge showed normal readings. There was no fire. There should be no smoke. But Christopher could smell it, could feel it burning his throat and stinging his eyes. Nathan was coughing, fumbling for his oxygen mask. Christopher made the decision to divert. He could not explain what was happening, but something was profoundly wrong. He contacted air traffic control and declared an emergency, requesting immediate clearance to land at the nearest airport. The controller guided them toward Albuquerque, which was less than 20 minutes away. Christopher began their descent, his hands steady on the controls despite the fear coursing through his body. The cabin crew called from the back of the plane. Passengers were reporting the smell of smoke. Several were panicking, asking what was wrong, demanding to know if the plane was on fire. The senior flight attendant kept her voice calm as she explained that they were making a precautionary landing and that everything was under control. But Christopher could hear the fear beneath her professional composure. She could smell the smoke too. They all could. And still the children's voices continued over the radio. "We are falling. We are falling so fast. It is so cold. Mama, where are you? Papa, please help us." The voices were crying now, desperate and terrified. Christopher wanted to cover his ears, wanted to shut off the radio, but he needed to maintain communication with air traffic control. He turned down the volume as low as it would go, but he could still hear them. Those small voices calling out from somewhere dark and cold and impossible. The landing in Albuquerque was textbook perfect despite Christopher's shaking hands. Emergency vehicles were waiting on the tarmac, fire trucks and ambulances positioned along the runway. As soon as the plane came to a stop, maintenance crews swarmed the aircraft, searching for the source of the smoke. They found nothing. No fire, no mechanical failure, no explanation for what everyone on board had smelled so clearly. Christopher sat in the cockpit long after the passengers had deplaned, staring at the radio. The voices had stopped the moment they touched down. The temperature had returned to normal. The smell of smoke had vanished as if it had never existed. Nathan sat beside him in silence, his face pale and drawn. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. What could they possibly say? Later that evening, back at his hotel room, Christopher could not stop thinking about what had happened. The children's voices, the specific words they had used, the plane in the mountains. He opened his laptop and began searching through aviation incident databases. He filtered by date, by location, by type of aircraft. And then he found it. 15 years ago to the day, October 24th, a regional commuter flight designated as Flight 227 had crashed in the Rocky Mountains during an unexpected snowstorm. The plane had been flying a route similar to Christopher's, from Denver toward the southwest. It had encountered severe weather and gone down in a remote area of the Colorado Rockies. All 48 people on board were killed. Among the dead were 12 children, ranging in age from 4 to 14 years old. Most had been traveling with their families for fall vacation. Christopher read the accident report with trembling hands. The recovered black box had captured the final moments of the flight. Passengers screaming as the plane descended rapidly. Children crying out for their parents. The pilots desperately trying to regain control as they plummeted through the storm. And then silence. The wreckage had not been found for 3 weeks. Rescue teams had searched the mountains in brutal winter conditions, following the emergency beacon signal. When they finally located the crash site, everything was buried under snow. The victims had died on impact, at least. They had not suffered in the cold and dark for days, waiting for rescue that never came. Christopher pulled up a map and plotted both flight paths. His route that afternoon had taken him directly over the crash site. Not just near it, but directly above it. And the time of day matched almost exactly. 15 years ago, Flight 227 had gone down at 3:47 in the afternoon. Christopher had been flying over that same spot at 3:49. He found the audio analysis from the original crash investigation, the technical breakdown of the final minutes captured on the black box. He compared the frequency patterns, the vocal ranges, the specific phrases used. And then he listened to the recording he had made on his phone during his own flight. A recording he had started out of instinct when the voices first began. The patterns matched. The voices of the children calling out from Christopher's radio were identical to the voices recorded on the black box 15 years earlier. Christopher never flew on October 24th again. He put in a formal request with his airline to be removed from all flight schedules on that date, claiming personal reasons. He did not tell them about the voices or the smoke or the impossible cold in the cockpit. He knew how it would sound. Pilots who reported experiencing unexplained phenomena tended to find themselves grounded indefinitely, subjected to psychological evaluations and fitness for duty assessments. Christopher could not afford to lose his career over something he could not explain and no one would believe. But he changed his route assignments. He requested transfers to different regions, different flight paths, anything that would keep him away from the Rocky Mountains. He still flies, because flying is all he has ever known, all he has ever wanted to do. But he avoids certain routes now. He avoids certain dates. And sometimes, late at night when he cannot sleep, he hears those small voices in his memory, calling out for help that came too late, asking why nobody answered when they needed someone most, describing the cold and the dark and the terrible moment of falling through a winter sky toward mountains they could not see. Nathan quit flying 3 months after that day. He transferred to a desk job with the airline, processing flight plans and managing crew schedules. Christopher does not blame him. Some experiences change you in ways you cannot undo. Some voices stay with you long after the radio goes silent. And sometimes, the boundary between past and present, between living and dead, becomes thin enough for the lost to reach through and remind us that they are still there, still waiting, still calling out for someone to hear them in the darkness. Penelope Martinez had been looking forward to this trip for months. She and her husband James were celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary with a 2-week vacation in Thailand. They had spent 14 glorious days exploring temples in Bangkok, relaxing on beaches in Phuket, and eating their way through night markets in Chiang Mai. The trip had been everything they had hoped for and more. But now, as they boarded their international flight from Bangkok to Los Angeles, Penelope felt the familiar weight of returning to reality settling over her shoulders. The Boeing 777 was packed nearly to capacity, with over 300 passengers crammed into the economy cabin. Penelope and James had seats in row 23, about midway down the aircraft. They settled in for the long haul, knowing they faced 16 hours in the air with only a brief refueling stop in Tokyo. Penelope pulled out her neck pillow and eye mask, already planning to sleep through as much of the journey as possible. The first few hours of the flight were uneventful. The cabin crew served drinks and then dinner, a choice between chicken or beef that Penelope barely tasted. She chose the chicken, James chose the beef. They watched movies on their seatback screens, occasionally dozing off during the duller moments. Around them, other passengers did the same. Some read books, some worked on laptops, some slept with their heads tilted at uncomfortable angles against the windows. Penelope was midway through a romantic comedy when she heard the first scream. It came from somewhere behind them, maybe 8 or 9 rows back. A man's voice, raw and terrified, shouting words that Penelope could not quite make out. She pulled off her headphones and turned to look, along with dozens of other passengers who had been startled by the sound. What she saw made her blood run cold. A man in his 30s was standing in the aisle, his body rigid and shaking. His hands were clawing at his own face, his fingers digging into the skin hard enough to draw blood. Red streaks ran down his cheeks and jaw. His eyes were wild, unfocused, rolling back in his head. He was screaming incomprehensible sounds. Not words exactly. More like animal noises of pure distress. The woman who had been sitting next to him was pressed against the window. As far from him as she could get, her face twisted in horror. Flight attendants rushed down the aisle from both directions. One of them, a young woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, reached the man first and tried to calm him. She spoke in a soothing voice, holding her hands out in a gesture of peace. The man stopped screaming for just a moment, looked directly at her, and then lunged. He moved with shocking speed, grabbing the flight attendant's arm and sinking his teeth into her flesh. The attendant shrieked and tried to pull away, but the man's grip was like iron. Blood bloomed through the sleeve of her uniform. Other attendants converged on them, trying to separate the man from his victim. Passengers in nearby rows scrambled over each other, desperate to get away from the violence erupting in the aisle. Penelope felt James grab her hand, squeezing so hard it hurt. They watched in frozen horror as 3 flight attendants and 2 male passengers finally managed to wrestle the man to the floor. He continued thrashing and biting, his teeth snapping at anything within reach. Someone produced zip ties from the emergency equipment, and they bound his hands behind his back. But even restrained, he continued to convulse and scream, his body arching off the floor with inhuman strength. That was when Penelope noticed the others. 2 rows ahead and 3 rows back, 2 more passengers were beginning to exhibit the same behavior. A middle-aged woman was tearing at her clothes, ripping her blouse open and scratching at the skin of her chest until it bled. An elderly man was banging his head against the seat in front of him, over and over, hard enough that Penelope could hear the sickening crack of impact. The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers were screaming, some trying to help the affected individuals, others fleeing toward the front and back of the plane. Children were crying. Someone was praying loudly in a language Penelope did not recognize. The flight attendants were overwhelmed, trying to manage multiple emergencies simultaneously while maintaining some semblance of order. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but urgent. He announced that they were experiencing a medical emergency and would be making an emergency diversion to Anchorage, Alaska, the nearest airport capable of handling a wide-body aircraft. He asked all passengers to remain calm and follow the instructions of the cabin crew. But his words did little to ease the rising panic. Another passenger, a young man in his 20s, began showing symptoms. He stood up abruptly, knocking his laptop to the floor, and started screaming that there were insects crawling under his skin. He clawed at his arms, trying to dig them out, leaving deep gouges in his flesh. His girlfriend tried to restrain him, but he shoved her aside with such force that she fell into the lap of the passenger across the aisle. The flight attendants, now 5 of them working together, managed to subdue and restrain the new victim. But they were running out of supplies. They had only so many zip ties, only so many seatbelt extensions they could use as improvised restraints. And the victims kept multiplying. Within 20 minutes of the first incident, there were 5 people exhibiting the same horrifying symptoms. Violent, self-destructive, completely disconnected from reality. Penelope pulled James close and whispered that they needed to move away from the affected area. Other passengers had the same idea. Those in the forward cabin rushed toward the front, while those in the rear pushed toward the back. Penelope and James ended up in the very last rows of the plane, pressed against the rear galley along with 30 or 40 other terrified travelers. The flight attendants working that section tried to maintain order, but their faces betrayed their own fear. One of the restrained passengers managed to break free. The zip ties had been cutting into his wrists, and in his frenzied state, he had pulled and twisted until his hands slipped through, leaving rings of raw, bleeding flesh. He lurched to his feet and ran down the aisle, blood dripping from his wrists, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. 2 male passengers, both large men who looked like they might work in security or law enforcement, tackled him before he could reach the huddled group in the back. But in the struggle, he bit one of them on the shoulder, his teeth tearing through shirt and skin. The bitten man did not show symptoms immediately, but everyone watching knew what might be coming. Was whatever this was contagious? Could it spread through saliva or blood? No one knew, and that uncertainty made everything worse. The man who had been bitten sat down heavily in an empty seat, holding his hand over his wounded shoulder, his face pale with shock and fear. The descent into Anchorage felt like it took hours, though it could not have been more than 45 minutes. The affected passengers continued their violent, self-destructive behavior despite being restrained. One woman had bitten through her own lip, blood running down her chin. Another man had broken his own fingers, snapping them backward in his attempts to free himself from his restraints. The sounds they made were inhuman, somewhere between screaming and growling, a noise that would haunt Penelope for the rest of her life. When the plane finally touched down, it was met by emergency vehicles from every service in the Anchorage area. Police, paramedics, fire trucks, even what looked like military personnel. The passengers were told to remain seated while a specialized team boarded the aircraft. They wore protective gear, full hazmat suits with face shields and gloves. They moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, sedating the violent passengers one by one with injections that finally, mercifully, silenced their screams. The sedated victims were carried off the plane on stretchers, strapped down and covered with blankets. Penelope watched them go and tried not to think about what might happen to them, what kind of facility they would be taken to, what kind of treatment existed for whatever had happened to them. The remaining passengers were held on the plane for another hour while officials decided what to do with them. Eventually, they were allowed to deplane, but were immediately escorted to a quarantine facility at the airport. It was a large hangar that had been hastily converted into a holding area, with folding chairs and tables set up in rows. Bottled water and packaged snacks were distributed. Medical personnel moved through the U-of-I crowd, taking temperatures and asking questions about symptoms. Penelope and James sat close together, not talking, just holding hands and trying to process what they had witnessed. Around them, other passengers were doing the same. Some were crying. Some were making frantic phone calls to loved ones. Some sat in stunned silence, staring at nothing. It was 12 hours before they got answers. A representative from the Centers for Disease Control stood at the front of the hangar and explained what had happened. The in-flight meals had been contaminated. The catering company that supplied the airline had been illegally disposing of pharmaceutical waste from a nearby research facility. The waste had ended up in the food preparation area, specifically in the seasoning used for one of the meal options, the chicken dish. The one Penelope had eaten. The contamination had caused acute psychotic episodes in those who consumed enough of it. The chemical compound, which the CDC representative did not name, had acted as a powerful neurotoxin, essentially short-circuiting the parts of the brain responsible for rational thought and impulse control. It had turned ordinary people into violent, self-destructive shells of themselves within hours of consumption. Of the 5 passengers who had exhibited severe symptoms, 2 had died from injuries sustained during their psychotic episodes. One had caused so much damage to his own brain by repeatedly striking his head that he never regained consciousness. Another had bitten through major blood vessels in her own wrists and bled out before sedation could take effect. The other 3 survived, but suffered permanent neurological damage. They would never be the same. The man who had been bitten during the struggle did not develop symptoms. The condition was not contagious after all. It required direct ingestion of the contaminated food. But that knowledge came too late to ease the trauma of those hours spent wondering if they were all infected, if they would all succumb to the same violent madness. Penelope and James were cleared to continue their journey 3 days later. They flew on a different airline, on a different plane, and Penelope did not eat or drink anything for the entire flight. She sat rigid in her seat, hyperventilating every time someone coughed or moved suddenly in her peripheral vision. When they finally landed in Los Angeles and walked out of the airport into the California sunshine, Penelope broke down sobbing in the parking garage. She has not flown since. She cannot. Even thinking about boarding a plane triggers panic attacks so severe that she has to take medication to function. She and James take road trips now when they want to travel. Long drives across the country where they control every variable, where they know exactly what they are eating and drinking, where they can pull over and get out whenever the claustrophobia becomes too much. But sometimes, late at night, Penelope still hears those sounds. The screaming and growling of people who had lost themselves to chemicals that should never have been in their bodies. She thinks about how arbitrary it was, how she had chosen chicken while James had chosen beef, how that single random decision had put her at risk while sparing him. She thinks about the 2 people who died, about the 3 who survived but lost themselves anyway. And she thinks about how quickly everything can fall apart, how a routine flight can become a nightmare in the span of minutes. How safety is an illusion we tell ourselves to keep functioning in a world where contamination and chaos are always just one meal away. Stella Reynolds had been working as a flight attendant for 12 years. In that time, she had learned to read people with remarkable accuracy. She could tell within 30 seconds of greeting a passenger whether they would be pleasant, demanding, nervous, or problematic. It was a skill that made her job easier and helped her provide better service. But on the red-eye flight from Chicago to Los Angeles on a cold February evening, her ability to read people would become something she wished she had never developed. The flight was scheduled to depart O'Hare International Airport at 11:45 and arrive at LAX at 2:30 in the morning local time. It was the kind of flight that attracted business travelers trying to maximize their time and budget-conscious passengers willing to endure the inconvenience of overnight travel for cheaper fares. The first-class cabin was only half full, with maybe 8 passengers scattered across the 16 available seats. Stella noticed the man in seat 2A immediately during boarding. He was in his late 50s or early 60s, well-dressed in an expensive suit that looked custom-tailored. His hair was silver at the temples, neatly combed, and he wore gold-rimmed glasses that gave him a distinguished, professorial appearance. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to success and respect. But there was something off about him, something Stella could not quite identify. His hands shook slightly as he stowed his carry-on bag. His eyes were red-rimmed, as if he had been crying. And when Stella greeted him and offered to hang his jacket, he looked at her with an expression of such profound sadness that it made her chest tighten. The flight took off on schedule. Once they reached cruising altitude, Stella began her service rounds in first class. She offered drinks and snacks, making pleasant conversation with the few passengers who were still awake. Most had already reclined their seats and closed their eyes, hoping to catch a few hours of sleep before landing. But the man in 2A was wide awake, staring out the window into the darkness. When Stella approached his row, she noticed he had been drinking. There were 2 empty miniature bottles of whiskey on his tray table, and his speech was slightly slurred when he requested another. Stella hesitated. Airline policy was clear about serving alcohol to passengers who were already intoxicated. But the man was not being disruptive or aggressive. He was just sad, heartbreakingly sad. She made a judgment call and poured him another whiskey, adding some ice and a splash of water. He thanked her quietly and turned back to the window. An hour into the flight, the man pressed his call button. Stella walked up the aisle to his seat, expecting a request for water or perhaps a blanket. Instead, he looked up at her with tears streaming down his face and asked if she had a few minutes to talk. Stella glanced around the cabin. The other passengers in first class were all asleep. Her colleague was in the galley preparing for the morning beverage service. She should have said no, should have politely deflected and returned to her duties. But something in the man's eyes stopped her. He was not looking for attention or sympathy. He was looking for a witness. Stella sat down in the empty seat across the aisle from him. She asked if he was feeling all right, if there was anything she could do to help. The man shook his head slowly and said he was not all right, that he had not been all right for 6 years, and that he never would be all right again. Then he started talking. He told Stella that his name was Richard. He told her that he was dying of pancreatic cancer and had maybe 3 weeks left to live. The doctors had given him 6 months when they first diagnosed him, but the disease had progressed faster than expected. He was on his way to Los Angeles to spend his final days with his sister, the only family he had left. And he needed to tell someone the truth before he died, because the weight of it was crushing him, and he could not carry it alone into whatever came next. 6 years ago, Richard said, he had murdered his business partner. The partner's name was Michael Chen, and they had co-owned a successful technology consulting firm in Seattle. They had built the company together from nothing, worked side by side for 15 years, and become as close as brothers. But Richard had wanted more. He had wanted complete control, wanted Michael's share of the profits, wanted to be the sole owner of everything they had created together. So Richard had planned it carefully. They had been attending a technology conference in Seattle, staying at the same hotel downtown. On the last night of the conference, Richard had suggested they celebrate their latest contract with drinks in Michael's hotel room. Michael had agreed enthusiastically. He had trusted Richard completely, had never suspected that his partner and friend was capable of betrayal. Richard described every detail with disturbing clarity. The way he had waited until Michael had consumed several drinks and was relaxed and off guard. The way he had maneuvered the conversation toward the balcony, suggesting they step outside to admire the view of the city lights. The way Michael had stood at the railing, drink in hand, talking about his wife and 2 daughters and how grateful he was for the life they had built. And the way Richard had placed both hands on Michael's back and pushed. Stella felt bile rising in her throat. She wanted to stand up, to walk away, to call someone and report what she was hearing. But she remained frozen in her seat, listening as Richard continued his confession. He described the sound Michael had made as he fell, a short cry of surprise and fear that was cut off when his body hit the pavement 12 stories below. He described how Richard had gone back into the room, wiped down his glass, and called hotel security to report that his business partner had fallen from the balcony. The investigation had been perfunctory. Michael had been drinking. The balcony railing was relatively low. There were no witnesses and no evidence of foul play. The death was ruled an accidental fall. Michael's wife and daughters were devastated, but they accepted the official explanation. They never suspected that Richard, the man who delivered a heartfelt eulogy at the funeral and promised to take care of Michael's family, was the one who had killed him. Richard told Stella how he had inherited Michael's share of the business per the terms of their partnership agreement, how he had sold the company 6 months later for millions of dollars, how he had used that money to build an even larger company, to acquire luxury homes and expensive cars, to live the life he had always believed he deserved, and how, 2 years after Michael's death, he had married Michael's widow. Stella felt her stomach lurch. She asked if Michael's widow knew what Richard had done. Richard shook his head. No one knew. He had been living with the secret for 6 years, sharing a bed with the woman whose husband he had murdered, raising her children as his own, pretending to be the devoted stepfather while knowing that he had stolen their real father from them. Richard pulled out his wallet with trembling hands and showed Stella a newspaper clipping he had been carrying for 6 years. It was Michael's obituary, a smiling photo of a man in his 40s, with kind eyes and a warm expression. Underneath was a brief description of his life, his career, his dedication to his family. Richard had read that obituary every single day since the murder. He said it was his penance, his reminder of what he had done, though he knew no amount of remembering could undo the act itself. Then Richard pulled out several cocktail napkins from the seat pocket in front of him. He took a pen from his jacket and began writing. Stella watched in stunned silence as he filled napkin after napkin with his confession. The date and location of the murder, the method, the motive, every detail he had just told her, now documented in his own handwriting. When he finished, he signed and dated each napkin and handed them to Stella. He begged her to give them to the police when they landed. He said he could not face Michael's family himself, could not look into their eyes and tell them what he had done. But he needed someone to know. He needed the truth to come out before he died. Needed Michael's daughters to understand that their father had not been careless or drunk or suicidal. He had been murdered by someone he trusted, and that someone deserved to be held accountable even if justice came too late to punish him properly. Stella asked Richard why he had waited so long. Why confess now, when he was already dying, when the cancer would claim him before any trial could take place? Richard said it was precisely because he was dying that he could finally speak. He had been terrified of prison, of losing everything he had gained through his crime. But now none of that mattered. The cancer had taken his future, his comfort, his dignity. All he had left was the truth, and carrying it to his grave felt like a final betrayal of Michael, of Michael's family, of the friendship they had once shared before Richard's greed had destroyed it all. Other passengers were beginning to stir as the flight approached Los Angeles. Stella excused herself and went directly to the cockpit. She told the captain what had happened, showed him the napkins covered in Richard's handwriting. The captain immediately contacted airport security and requested that law enforcement meet the aircraft upon arrival. When the plane landed, police officers boarded and escorted Richard off in handcuffs. He went quietly, without protest, looking almost relieved to finally be facing consequences for what he had done. Stella gave the officers her statement and handed over the signed napkins that constituted Richard's written confession. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives reopened Michael Chen's case and reviewed all the original evidence with fresh eyes. They interviewed witnesses from the hotel that night, examined security footage that had been preserved, and consulted with forensic experts about the balcony fall. What they discovered supported Richard's confession. The angle of Michael's fall had been inconsistent with someone accidentally losing balance. There had been bruising on his back that the original examiner had dismissed as impact trauma, but which could have been caused by hands pushing him. The investigation had been incomplete, rushed, biased by the assumption of accident rather than murder. Richard was formally charged with first-degree murder, but he never stood trial. His cancer progressed rapidly, and he died in the hospital 3 weeks after his confession, just as he had predicted. But before he died, he gave a full videotaped statement to prosecutors, confirming everything he had told Stella on the plane and providing additional details that only the killer could have known. The truth came out. Michael's family learned that his death had not been an accident. Richard's widow divorced him posthumously, filing legal action to reclaim the assets he had acquired through murdering her first husband. Michael's daughters, now young adults, gave statements to the press about their father's memory and how Richard had stolen not just his life, but their opportunity to grow up, knowing the truth about how he had died. Stella was called to testify at various hearings related to the case. She had to relive that night on the plane over and over, describing Richard's demeanor, his words, the way his hands had shaken as he wrote out his confession on those napkins. The experience changed her. She found herself looking at passengers differently now, wondering what secrets they carried, what burdens they bore. She developed insomnia and had to take a leave of absence from work to deal with the anxiety and nightmares. She still works as a flight attendant, but she no longer engages in personal conversations with passengers beyond professional pleasantries. She learned that sometimes people confess because they genuinely want absolution. And sometimes they confess because they can no longer bear the weight of their secrets alone. Richard had been both. He had wanted forgiveness that Stella could not give him, and he had needed to share the truth that had been slowly destroying him from the inside. Stella thinks about Richard sometimes, usually late at night when she cannot sleep. She thinks about the look in his eyes when he handed her those napkins, the desperate hope that telling the truth might somehow matter, might somehow balance the scales of what he had done. She thinks about Michael Chen and his daughters, and how one moment of greed and violence had rippled through so many lives, creating waves of grief and betrayal that would never fully settle. And she thinks about the strange, terrible intimacy of that red-eye flight, when a dying man chose her as his confessor, when she became the keeper of a truth that would expose a murder and destroy what remained of a killer's legacy. She had been trained to serve drinks and ensure passenger safety, not to bear witness to deathbed confessions or deliver killers into the hands of justice. But that is what she had become that night, whether she wanted the role or not. The napkins Richard wrote on are now evidence, stored in a file somewhere in the Los Angeles Police Department archives. But Stella remembers every word he wrote, every detail he shared. She carries his confession with her just as surely as if those napkins were still in her possession. Some burdens cannot be set down, no matter how much we might wish to forget them. Landon Hayes had been working as an air traffic controller for 8 years. His office was a glass-walled tower at a regional airport on the outskirts of Athens, Greece. From his position, he could see the runways stretching out beneath him, watch planes take off and land with mechanical precision, and monitor the radar screens that tracked aircraft across Greek airspace. It was demanding work that required intense focus and the ability to make split-second decisions. Lives depended on his competence every single day. He took that responsibility seriously. It was a clear Tuesday morning in August when Landon first made contact with Flight 522. The commercial flight from Cyprus to Athens carried 121 passengers and crew, a routine run that dozens of planes made every week. Landon confirmed their flight path and altitude, exchanged the standard communications with the pilots, and watched their signal move steadily across his radar screen. Everything appeared normal. 10 minutes after their last communication, Landon attempted to contact the flight for a routine altitude check. There was no response. He tried again, using the emergency frequency. Silence. A cold knot formed in his stomach. Loss of radio communication was not unheard of, but it was never a good sign. He immediately alerted his supervisor and contacted nearby aircraft to see if they could relay messages to Flight 522. No one could raise them. Landon watched the radar blip continue on its programmed course. The autopilot was clearly engaged and functioning. But why were the pilots not responding? He contacted Greek Air Force Command and requested they scramble interceptor jets to perform a visual inspection of the aircraft. Authorization came through within minutes. This was exactly the kind of situation that protocols existed to handle. But knowing the steps did not make the dread in Landon's chest any less acute. The fighter jets reached Flight 522 within 15 minutes. The pilots radioed back their observations, and Landon felt his blood turn to ice. Through the cockpit windows, they could see the captain and first officers slumped over the controls, completely motionless. The fighter pilots maneuvered closer, trying to see into the passenger cabin through the windows. What they reported made Landon's hands shake on his controls. Every passenger they could see appeared to be unconscious. Heads lolled against windows and seat backs. Bodies slumped in unnatural positions. No one was moving. No one was awake. The plane was flying itself through the sky, a ghost ship carrying over 100 people who appeared to be dead or dying. Landon immediately contacted emergency services and briefed them on the situation. Medical teams, fire crews, and crisis counselors were dispatched to the airport where the plane was scheduled to land. But there was a terrible problem. The plane had enough fuel for maybe another 70 minutes of flight. After that, the engines would die and the aircraft would fall from the sky. They needed to get someone conscious in that cockpit, needed to get control of the plane, needed to do something before time ran out. One of the fighter pilots reported seeing movement in the cabin. A single figure, a flight attendant based on the uniform, was staggering down the aisle. The pilot described the attendant's movements as erratic and uncoordinated, like someone who was severely disoriented or injured. The attendant was moving toward the cockpit, using the seatbacks for support, clearly struggling to stay upright. Landon and everyone else in the control tower focused on that single moving figure. This was their hope. If the attendant could reach the cockpit, could open the locked door, could somehow revive the pilots or contact ground control, they might be able to save the plane. Landon began broadcasting instructions on all frequencies, explaining how to operate the radio, how to unlock the cockpit door, how to use the emergency oxygen systems. He did not know if the attendant could hear him, but he kept talking anyway. The fighter pilots continued their commentary. The attendant had reached the cockpit door, was trying the handle, was pounding on the door. But the strength of those impacts was visibly weak, the movements becoming slower and less coordinated with each passing second. And then, as Landon and his team watched helplessly through the relay of the fighter pilot's descriptions, the attendant collapsed. The figure crumpled to the floor of the aisle and did not get back up. The last person who had been conscious on that plane was now just another motionless body. Landon felt tears burning his eyes, but forced himself to maintain his composure. He still had a job to do. Flight 522 continued flying its programmed route. It passed over Athens, sailed past the airport where emergency crews waited, and continued north. The autopilot had no awareness that everyone on board was dying or dead. It simply followed its instructions to maintain altitude and heading until the fuel ran out. Landon tracked the plane for another hour. He coordinated with military aircraft to maintain visual contact. He prepared emergency response teams along the projected flight path for when the plane inevitably went down. And he listened to the terrible silence on the radio frequency where the pilots should have been communicating. When the fuel gauges finally read empty, the engines began to fail one by one. The plane started to descend. Not a controlled emergency landing piloted by trained professionals, but a dead weight dropping from the sky. The fighter pilots escorted it down, watching helplessly as it fell toward the mountains north of Athens. Flight 522 crashed into a hillside at nearly 400 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact, scattering debris across the mountainside. There were no survivors. All 121 people on board were killed. The investigation that followed revealed what Landon had already suspected in his heart. The cabin pressurization system had failed shortly after takeoff due to a maintenance error. A switch in the cockpit had been left in the wrong position during a routine inspection the night before. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the cabin had not pressurized properly. The oxygen levels had dropped gradually, causing hypoxia in everyone on board. Hypoxia is insidious. It does not announce itself with pain or obvious symptoms. It simply makes you tired, confused, euphoric even. Your brain stops working properly, but you do not realize it is happening. The pilots had likely noticed something was wrong, had tried to address the problem, but their cognitive function had degraded too quickly for them to take effective action. Within minutes, they had lost consciousness. The passengers had suffered the same fate, probably never even realizing they were in danger. They had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. The flight attendant who had been seen moving through the cabin had been trained in emergency oxygen procedures. That training had probably saved them temporarily, allowing them to remain conscious longer than everyone else. But without access to the cockpit, without the ability to fly the plane or deploy emergency oxygen to the other passengers, they had only delayed the inevitable. They had died trying to save people who were already beyond saving. The cockpit voice recorder captured the pilot's final minutes. Landon was required to listen to the recording as part of the investigation. He heard their confusion as warning alarms sounded. He heard them trying to diagnose the problem, their words becoming slower and more slurred as the oxygen deprivation affected their brains. He heard the moment when their speech stopped making sense, when they could no longer form coherent thoughts. And then he heard silence, just the sound of breathing that gradually slowed and eventually stopped. Landon required extensive psychological counseling after Flight 522. He had nightmares about watching that radar blip move across his screen, knowing everyone on board was dying and being completely powerless to help them. He would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing phantom radio transmissions, the voices of pilots who would never speak again. He continued working as an air traffic controller, but he requested a transfer to cargo operations. He could not handle tracking passenger flights anymore. Every time he saw a plane full of people on his radar, he imagined them unconscious in their seats, imagined the plane flying on autopilot toward an inevitable crash, imagined himself watching helplessly as they died in slow motion across his screen. The official report concluded that Flight 522 had been doomed from the moment the pressurization system failed. The pilots had succumbed to hypoxia before they could descend to a safe altitude or deploy emergency oxygen. The passengers had never had a chance. They had died peacefully, slipping into unconsciousness without panic or pain. In the report's clinical language, it was described as a relatively merciful death. But Landon did not find any mercy in it. He had watched 121 people die over the course of 70 minutes. He had listened to fighter pilots describe the silent cockpit and motionless passengers. He had seen that single flight attendant try desperately to save everyone and fail. And he had been completely, utterly powerless to change the outcome. Sometimes, late at night, Landon still pulls up the archived radar data from that morning. He watches the blip that represents Flight 522 move across the screen, following its programmed path with mechanical precision. He knows that at the moment captured in that data, everyone on board was already unconscious or dead. He knows the plane was already a flying tomb, but he watches anyway, as if seeing it again might somehow change the ending, might somehow give him a chance to save people who died years ago. He cannot. The dead stay dead. The plane still crashes. And Landon is left with the knowledge that sometimes the worst disasters are the ones you see coming but cannot prevent. The ones that unfold in terrible slow motion while you stand by and watch. Knowing that every second brings more death and there is nothing you can do but bear witness to the tragedy.